Hey, family, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this space. And if you've been walking with me for a while, you already know we don't do perfect over here. Let's get into it. After the last episode, I kept thinking about something I didn't say. I talked about falling apart quietly, about holding everything together on the outside while struggling on the inside. But I never really talked about the moment. The exact moment I realized I wasn't okay. And that moment, it matters. Because for a long time, I didn't recognize what was happening to me. Or maybe if I'm honest, I recognized it and kept telling myself it wasn't real. There's a difference between not knowing something and refusing to acknowledge it. And I lived in this space for a while. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to struggle silently. It doesn't happen like that. It's slow, it's gradual, it's the accumulation of pressure over time. You carry one responsibility, then another, then another. You handle stress, you solve problems, you show up for people, and every time something difficult happens, you tell yourself the same thing. I'll deal with it later. I'll rest when things calm down. I just have to push through this season. But what happens when the season never slows down? What happens when pushing through becomes a normal way you live? For a long time, that's what my life looked like. I was functioning, at least from the outside, and everything probably looked fine. I was working, I was showing up, I was doing what needed to be done. People saw strength. But what they didn't see, what nobody saw, was how heavy everything felt inside. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just heavy. And when something stays heavy long enough, you start believing that's just how life feels. I remember thinking something was wrong with me. Not in a loud way, just small thoughts that would show up quietly. Why am I so tired? Why does everything feel harder than it used to be? Why do things that used to bring me joy feel distant now? And instead of sitting with those questions, I ignored them. Because ignoring your pain is easier than confronting it, at least in the moment. Strong people are really good at ignoring themselves. We know how to take care of everyone else. We know how to solve problems. We know how to handle pressure. But what we don't always know how to do is sit with our own emotional reality. Because if you stop moving, if you stop pushing, if you actually pause long enough to listen to yourself, you might hear something you're not ready to face. The moment I realized I wasn't okay wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a big breakdown, no shouting, no crisis, just a quiet moment where I felt exhausted in a way that didn't make sense. I remember sitting still and thinking, I shouldn't feel this tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. The kind of tired that doesn't disappear after sleep. The kind that follows you throughout your day. And that scared me because I've been through hard times before. I knew what struggle felt like. But this felt different. This felt like I was carrying something invisible. I started paying attention to small things, little signs I had ignored before, how easily overwhelmed I felt, how quiet moments felt louder than they used to, how my patience was thinner, how my mind never seemed to rest. And the more I noticed these things, the harder it became to pretend everything was okay. But here's the truth. Admit you're not okay is harder when you're used to being strong. Because people depend on you. People expect you to handle things. People trust that you'll keep going no matter what. And when you've built your identity around being dependable, acknowledging your own struggle, it feels like failure. But it's not. It's awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable. But awareness is also the beginning of healing. I had to sit with myself long enough to say something I have avoided saying. I don't feel like myself. And those words, they didn't come out easily. But once I said them, something shifted. Because honesty opened doors that denial keeps closing. I realized I had been living in survival mode. Not intentionally, just habitually. Survival mode, it teaches you how to function without feeling, how to keep moving without processing, and how to manage responsibilities without checking in with yourself. And survival mode, it works. It works for emergencies, but it was never meant to be permanent. When survival becomes your lifestyle, you forget what peace feels like. You forget what rest feels like. And you forget what it feels like to be present instead of just managing. And that realization was painful for me because it meant I had ignored myself longer than I should have. But here's what I've learned. Healing doesn't begin when everything in your life changes. Healing begins when you finally acknowledge the truth of where you are. Not where you wish you were, not where people expect you to be, just where you are. And sometimes that truth is simple. I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. I'm not okay. And those words don't make you weak. They make you honest. I think many people are waiting for a breaking point. We believe things have to fall apart before we take our own pain seriously. But sometimes healing, it begins earlier than you think. Sometimes healing begins with a quiet moment of awareness, a moment where you pause long enough to ask yourself, how am I really doing? Not the polite answer, not the automatic response, the real answer. When I started asking myself that question honestly, I realized something. I had been showing up for everyone else, but I had been showing up for myself. I had been carrying responsibilities, but ignoring my emotional weight. And I had been solving problems, but not processing my own experiences. And that imbalance eventually catches up with you. The moment I realized I wasn't okay, it didn't solve everything, but it started something. It started honesty, it started reflection, and it started the slow process of healing. Because you can't change what you refuse to acknowledge. You can't care for wounds you pretend don't exist. And once I admitted where I was emotionally, I could finally begin to move forward. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that moment. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was truthful. And truth creates space for growth. It creates space for support, and it creates space for healing. If you're listening right now and life feels heavier than it should, I want to encourage you to pause. Not everything requires you to push harder. Not everything requires you to be strong. And sometimes growth begins when you stop pushing and start listening to yourself. You deserve to be honest about where you are. You deserve to acknowledge when something inside you needs care. And you deserve healing. And that healing often begins with awareness. I'm still learning this. Still learning how to check in with myself. Still learning how to recognize when life starts moving fast. And still learning how to choose honesty over denial. And maybe that's what growth looks like. Not perfection, just awareness. And if you're in that moment right now, the moment where you're realizing you're not okay, please hear this. That realization is not failure. It's the beginning of something better. Because awareness leads to honesty. And honesty leads to healing. Next episode, we're going to talk about something many people experience after this realization. What happens after you admit you've been living in survival mode? And how do you slow down? How do you rebuild your peace? And how do you learn to live instead of just managing life? That's the conversation we're stepping into next. And I think it's one a lot of us need. I'll talk to you next time. Let's heal and grow together. And I'll see you in the next episode of the Healing Series. God bless.